What if revenge didn't come with the swing of a blade, but with the quiet pull of a thread? What if death didn't roar through battlefields, but crept silently between folds of cotton and silk? In 1853 Tennessee, a grand plantation family began to waste away, slowly, mysteriously, and their downfall was sown with the same hands that dressed them. Her name was Louisa, the enslaved seamstress whose weapon wasn't steel, but a needle. And no one, not a soul, ever saw her coming. The midsummer air in Tennessee hung thick that year, sticky, stifling, and heavy with secrets. Cotton dresses swayed gently on the line outside, drying beneath a pitiless sun. Beyond them stood the White family's mansion, tall, cold, and proud, its white pillars gleaming like the teeth of something watching. Inside, the family's life went on as it always had. The mistress sipped her afternoon tea in the parlor, fanning herself lazily. The master read the paper under his wide-brimmed hat, grumbling about the heat. The children played in the hall, their laughter echoing faintly through the rooms. To anyone passing by, it was a picture of peace. But peace, like thread, can snap with the smallest pull. Behind the mansion, in a smaller building shadowed by the oaks, rows of enslaved women sat over benches, heads bowed, fingers moving in quiet rhythm, stitching garments for people who would never know their names. Among them sat Louisa, slender, calm, and graceful in her stillness. Her hands worked fast, her stitches precise, her face unreadable. Only her eyes betrayed her, dark, steady, and alive with something deeper than submission. Her needle moved with purpose. Each dress, each vest, each child's coat that passed through her fingers carried the weight of memory and intent. It began so softly that no one noticed. A rash on the mistress's wrist, just a bit of irritation. A cough from one of the children, dismissed as a chill. Then fatigue, dizziness, confusion. One by one, they began to fade. The doctor came and went, shaking his head over his notes. "It's the summer fever," he said. "Too much heat, too little clean water." He prescribed herbs and rest. But the fevers didn't pass. They worsened. The mistress's skin began to blister. The master's temper turned wild, his eyes dull and glassy. The children's laughter quieted into faint, tired cries. Still, Louisa sewed on. Her face calm, her lips sealed. By the 20th day, the youngest daughter was gone, her body still, her dress freshly mended by Louisa's hand. The family wept quietly, the plantation went silent. Then the matriarch followed, her frail voice whispering of fire under her skin before she slipped away. Fear began to seep through the house like smoke. The doctor returned, suspicion in his eyes. He spoke of poison. He collected bits of fabric, tracing oily spots and discolored seams. But there were no laboratories then, no tests to prove his theories. Only whispers. Whispers that smelled faintly of bitter almonds. Soon the household was paralyzed by rumor. "Don't wear the satin," one servant whispered. "It burns." "It's the thread," said another. "The thread kills." The White family locked themselves indoors, afraid of the very clothes they once wore with pride. Yet Louisa kept working, silent, tireless, untouchable. No one dared accuse her. No one dared look too closely at the woman whose eyes seemed to see everything. And while the house crumbled under sickness and grief, Louisa's mind wandered back to the years before Tennessee. To a time when she was only 14, sold from a plantation in North Carolina after a disciplinary incident that no one dared to record in detail. There were whispers, though, that a white overseer who had hurt her once died not long after, clutching his stomach in agony. They said Louisa's face had been calm then, too. In Tennessee, she had learned from an old woman named Bet, a midwife, half-blind and slow-moving, but sharp as a knife in the ways of nature. Bet taught her the language of roots and saps, of flowers that healed, and those that killed. "The earth gives you everything," Bet would whisper. "You just have to know how to ask." Louisa listened. And learned. Years passed. The world remained cruel. She stitched, she endured, she remembered. Until the day came when she stopped asking for mercy, and started sowing her vengeance instead. No one saw her gather the herbs. No one saw her crush the roots into a fine, oily paste. No one saw her mix them into the fabric dye, where death could hide beneath color and softness. She worked with precision, a scientist of sorrow, an artist of quiet justice. When the final funeral carriage left the estate, the plantation was silent. The master's chair sat empty. The linens, her linens, were burned in the yard. But Louisa? She was still there. Calm, still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When the whispers finally reached her, that the White family had all perished, she did not smile. She did not weep. She simply looked down at the small puncture on her finger, a mark from the last time she'd sewn their clothes. Some said she vanished soon after. Others claimed she was sold again, her name erased from every record. But sometimes, the women in nearby towns would find strange burns on the fabric of their master's garments, and they would whisper her name like a prayer, or a warning. Louisa. The woman who stitched her revenge into silk.
Louisa, quiet, obedient, efficient. Her name never found its way into any ledger or history book, but her presence clung to every frayed seam and every patch like a secret too heavy to tell. As the heat thickened that summer, so did the fear. The once grand plantation began to feel like a coffin. Guests stopped visiting. Windows stayed shuttered. The nights stretched long, filled with restless sleep and the sound of coughing echoing through the halls. The air hung heavy, thick with sickness, sweat, and the terror of not knowing. The servants moved like phantoms, whispering prayers under their breath as they crossed the darkened corridors. The White family locked themselves in their rooms, their laughter gone, replaced by the creak of floors and the soft whimper of dying breaths. Behind those closed doors, sheets were stained with fever and sores bloomed like curses upon their skin, the very skin that brushed against Louisa's careful stitches. But Louisa's story didn't start there, in that dying house. It began long before, in the red dirt of North Carolina. She was born in chains, a child of bondage, and by 14, sold down south like property after what her previous master called a disciplinary incident. That was the official story. The truth, whispered through the quarters, was far darker. A young overseer, cruel and careless, had once hurt her. Days later, he'd been found writhing in the fields, foam on his lips, eyes wide and glassy. He died before anyone could call for help. Louisa was sold soon after, her silence her only defense. When she arrived in Tennessee, she was different, quiet, but with an eerie composure. She didn't cry, didn't flinch. The mistress noticed her skill with a needle and spared her the brutal work of the cotton fields. Louisa became the house seamstress, mending, sewing, stitching life into the very garments that chained her. But what no one realized was that she carried more than a talent for fabric. She carried knowledge and vengeance that had learned patience. In the plantation's quiet rhythm, she found an unlikely ally, Bet, the old midwife. Nearly blind, her hands trembling with age, Bet still remembered the old ways. The ways from before capture. Before chains. The ways that used roots, seeds, and leaves to heal, or to kill. Every plant has a twin, Bet whispered one evening, her milky eyes turned toward the moon. One saves, one destroys. The trick is knowing which one you're holding. Louisa listened. She learned. And in the long, humid nights, she practiced. Under the pretense of collecting herbs for fabric dyes and washing water, Louisa roamed the edges of the forest. She gathered jiceweed seeds, the pale berries of belladonna, and the sticky resin from hemlock stems. Each one deadly. Alone they could wound. Together, in the right balance, they could whisper death through the skin itself. Slowly, silently, without a trace. No one questioned her errands. Why would they? She was just the seamstress, small, quiet, harmless. Her hands belonged to servitude, her silence mistaken for obedience. But with every gown she hemmed, every shirt she repaired, her needle became something sacred, a tool of justice disguised as duty. And so, with each stitch, Louisa made a choice. A thread became a promise. A promise that pain would one day return home, not through rebellion or bloodshed, but through the very fabrics that once wrapped the oppressors in comfort. Her revenge would not scream. It would not beg. It would breathe softly through cotton, seep through silk, and settle beneath the skin, until the powerful learned what suffering truly felt like. And in that house, as fever consumed the walls and fear took root, Louisa stitched on. Focused. Silent. Because vengeance doesn't always wear a blade. Sometimes, it hums through a needle, in the steady rhythm of hands that never forget. Death, Louisa once thought, didn't always have to shout. It could whisper, hidden in a fold of fabric, tucked in a lining just a shade too heavy, stitched beneath a collar with steady hands and quiet intent. She worked slowly, deliberately. Time was her ally. Death didn't need to come swiftly. In fact, she preferred it didn't. Let it move gently, like a fever through summer air, unseen until it was too late. By midsummer, strange patterns began to emerge. Servants who handled the family's clothes too often grew ill. A young maid fainted while wearing a cast-off shawl. A stable boy, barely 16, developed oozing ulcers after carrying freshly pressed coats. The plantation doctor scratched his head and scribbled notes in confusion. Perhaps it was bad water, mold, or the swamp air. But nothing fit. The symptoms came and went, fast and slow, cruelly inconsistent. The White family, proud and stubborn, dismissed his concerns. Nonsense, the master barked. We're not dying from laundry. But in the quarters, the whispers ran deeper. Louisa's hands, they said, carried a power, maybe a blessing, maybe a curse. Some feared her and stepped aside when she passed. Others, quietly reverent, left offerings by her door, beads, thread, small roots wrapped in leaves. Not gifts, acknowledgments. They knew, or at least suspected, that Louisa's silence held something more than obedience. The family's decline quickened. Their youngest son, once full of noise and mischief, wasted away until he could barely lift his spoon. The master began to lose his grip on reality, muttering to unseen figures, accusing his own children of betrayal. The mistress lay in bed, her breaths short and sharp, her skin blistered beneath the lace sleeves Louisa had so carefully mended. Talk of witchcraft crept through the region. A preacher was summoned from miles away. He arrived with fire in his voice but left with trembling hands. This house, he whispered, is already claimed. And Louisa? She kept sewing. Her face calm. Her fingers steady. Her silence, her truest weapon. One night, the cook swore she saw Louisa speaking by the edge of the woods, to no one, or maybe to someone unseen. A shadow near the trees. Some said it was Bet's ghost, the old midwife who had taught Louisa the names of deadly roots. When questioned, Louisa only bowed her head and returned to her stitching. By late August, the grand plantation had become a tomb. No piano notes drifted through the halls, no laughter echoed across the porch. Only the heavy stillness of a house being swallowed by its own sickness. The family's fall was no longer a mystery, it was a certainty. The master, once iron-fisted and cruel, now stumbled through the corridors like a lost child. His skin yellowed, his eyes ringed with red. He muttered names, flinched at his own reflection, and tore the shirt from his back mid-meal, screaming that it burned him. 2 guests from Alabama witnessed it and fled before nightfall. His wife, pale and delirious, barely recognized the room around her. Her body blistered with sores that bled at the slightest touch. A new doctor, younger, more arrogant, declared it was arsenic. But how? He puzzled aloud. How does it burn through the skin? He ordered every room fumigated and every piece of clothing removed. Still, the sickness lingered. The children withered. The eldest son, heir to the estate, lay trapped in fevered dreams, scratching at his skin and sobbing about insects crawling beneath it. One night, he tore at his throat until his pillow turned red. The nurse who tried to calm him left that same night and never returned. The servants moved carefully now, communicating only through glances. They knew. They didn't need proof. They simply stopped touching the clothes. The laundry room fell silent, empty but for Louisa, who remained untouched. Her skin unblemished. Her hands steady. Death had danced around the household, but never touched her. Only one woman, Sarah, dared to whisper a confession. She'd once fetched a strange root from the woods for Louisa, something that wasn't for dye. It had a bitter, sour smell. She hadn't asked questions then. Now she couldn't stop wondering, what had it been for? Then one night, the overseer's daughter collapsed in the parlor, gasping for breath, her skin flushed and blistered. She had been wearing a shawl repaired by Louisa. Panic erupted. The overseer, a man as cruel as the master himself, stormed through the house, tearing apart Louisa's quarters. He found nothing. No bottles. No powders. Only folded cloth, neat spools of thread, and a single needle glinting in the candlelight. Louisa stood still, her hands clasped before her, her face unreadable. Not a word escaped her lips. The next morning, the overseer demanded she be locked away. But the master, barely lucid, raised a trembling hand and muttered from his bed, "She stays." His words, broken and weak, were the last command he ever gave. And Louisa? She sat back down at her table, the needle in her hand gleaming softly in the morning light. Stitch by stitch she continued her work, calm, precise, unstoppable. Because vengeance doesn't need to scream. It just needs a steady hand and time. They said the fire had taken the last of the records, that Louisa's name was never written anywhere, but her memory clung to the land like the scent of rain before a storm. More than 100 years later, the plantation still stands, its bones rotting quietly beneath a canopy of Tennessee trees. The once grand white estate is now little more than a carcass of wood and stone, half swallowed by vines and silence. Travelers rarely make it down the overgrown road. Even the air feels wrong there, thick, still, like it's holding its breath. Those who do find the ruins often turn back before stepping inside. The house looks ordinary from a distance, but as you draw closer, you notice the windows, black and empty, as if watching. Inside, the air carries a strange metallic tang, and the floorboards groan like something breathing beneath them. It was 1962 when a man named Calvin Murdoch bought the land for timber. He was practical, unbothered by ghost stories. But that changed when, under the floor of the sewing room, his workers uncovered a small iron trunk. Inside were neat stacks of folded cloth, each swatch labeled in precise handwriting, names. Every name matched a member of the White family's burial records. The fabric looked ordinary, but dark, oily stains spread across several pieces, and when one of the workers touched them, a rash blossomed across his arm that refused to heal. Murdoch left the property within the week. He sold the land for half its worth, claiming the soil was cursed. 2 decades later, in 1985, 2 anthropology students from Nashville visited the site, chasing whispers of the seamstress of Tennessee. They camped near the ruins and wrote of a silence that felt too deliberate, as though the house were listening. In her field notes, one of them, Annalise Turner, described finding rusted needles embedded in the floorboards, still sharp, pointing toward the sewing room wall. That night, she dreamed of a woman sitting before a shattered table, her hands moving rhythmically though no fabric remained. Annalise never returned from that trip. Her partner found her journal days later, the last lines smeared and unreadable, except for 2 words, "She's watching." Local archives hold only fragments of truth, pages too fragile to handle, ink faded by time. A few pieces remain. A doctor's journal that ends abruptly in 1853, a death ledger filled with more names than graves, and a letter from the mistress of the house written in trembling ink. Her final sentence reads, "She watches while we sleep. I know it now." Among the nearby black communities, the story never died. The elders still whisper of the woman who stitched her vengeance into silk. They never say her name aloud, but on certain nights, they leave small spools of thread on their windowsills, just in case she passes by. No one remembers who began the custom, only that breaking it brings misfortune. A preacher once tried to cleanse the land. He lasted 3 nights before fleeing into the woods, pale and wordless. When asked what he'd seen, he only said, "Some wounds never close. Some hands never stop sewing." Skeptics say Louisa never existed, that she's just guilt, sewn into folklore. But now and then, pieces of 19th century fabric appear in antique shops, finely stitched, aged but strangely preserved. Collectors speak of numb fingertips, of sudden fevers, of dreams filled with the soft rasp of thread through cloth. No scientific test has ever explained it. And so, the story lives on. The plantation remains untouched, not from reverence, but fear. The woods have claimed the road. The rafters sag, and no birds will nest there. But inside the sewing room, beneath a film of dust, something faint can still be seen. 5 letters scratched into the stone by a trembling hand. Lewis. No one knows what it means. A name? A confession? A warning? But when the wind moves through the ruins, carrying the sound of dry leaves against broken wood, it almost sounds like a needle pulling through cloth. Soft, steady, tennis.